Hi, everyone. So glad you could join us for another episode of Most Powerful Women in Sports, where the world's greatest marketers, media pros, athletes, and coaches share their remarkable journeys and how they achieve peak performance. We'd also like to hear from you, so join the conversation in the chat and questions in the Q&A box. Today, we'll be speaking with Jessica Berman, National Lacrosse League Deputy Commissioner and EVP of Business Affairs. We're going to talk to Jessica about leadership lessons learned from her different stops along the way. But first, a little background on Jessica. Jessica joined the National Lacrosse League in 2019 after 13 years with the NHL, where she was VP Community Development, Culture, and Growth. Jessica was and is the first woman to hold the title of Deputy Commissioner at any professional sports league in North America. She oversees all of the league's legal affairs and transactions, manages team services, and assists the commissioner with the National Lacrosse League's growth strategy. That's a lot to chew on. Jessica, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us. We have a lot to dig into here.
Thanks for having me.
This is crazy. You have a big job.
So I'm told, or so my kids tell me.
So let's start from the beginning. Just a little bit of, where you grew up and who shaped you in terms of your leadership style, if you got into sports. Just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, which for those who are less familiar, well, I call it real Brooklyn. It's not probably what people think of today as Brooklyn. Really, it was a melting pot of people from different backgrounds. And I was actually the minority in my community. And that really shaped me in terms of the things that drove me and inspired me in my life. I was always interested in and passionate about diversity, equity, and inclusion, really since I was a young child, and had firsthand and front row seat to the impact of how being underrepresented or marginalized in a community impact you. And that really was the catalyst for me wanting to work in sports, because I always believed that sport has the power to change the world, and was inspired by Nelson Mandela from the time I was a young child, and felt that if I could have a role to play in an industry that was a community asset the way that sports are, that would be the way that I wanted to have a positive impact on the world. In terms of my leadership style, I guess I'll start with my parents. Probably had the biggest impact on me. My mom's a child psychologist and forced a lot of self-reflection in my life, including daily journal writing, and just really being self-aware, taking tabs on at any given minute, hour, or day, what I need in order to be my best self. That was a practice that was instilled in me from the time I was young, really given permission to have ups and downs, and really just be human. And I do think that sort of empathy and compassion is not just how I lead myself through my life, but also how I try to mentor and manage and support others around me. And my dad was an entrepreneur, unfortunately passed away earlier this year, but he self-made, ran his own business, built from scratch, started pumping gas in his dad's gas station, and went on to buy a lot of gas stations and gas and oil businesses. And his hard work and work ethic really shapes who I am every single day.
Wow. Well, I want to get into a little bit more on the leadership side of things. That sounds really interesting to me on your approach. Were you always sporty? Is this something, were you a late bloomer, or were you into sports early on?
I was into sports as a fan from the time I was young, but actually my role directly in sports was really, I think, more on the periphery growing up. I don't know, my parents didn't have me play sports when I was a kid. Like, I was never put in team activities. I was a dancer. And so I was a cheerleader and part of the dance team throughout my life, through college actually. And through that ended up doing halftime shows and being sort of on the sidelines, but also played a role as a manager of various different teams from the time I was a freshman in high school, keeping stats and doing press notes and organizing interviews for players. And so I was always around sports. My brother was actually a football player and played in college. So I definitely had influences from him, watching him actually be on the field. So yeah, just always in and around sports.
Now, so how did you get into the NHL?
Hockey was actually my favorite sport growing up. And so for better or worse, it was sort of, to me, as a teenager, the pinnacle of working in sports. That was my framework because it was my favorite sport as a fan. And I worked at Proskauer Rose, which is the law firm that represents all the major sports leagues, but the NHL as well. And I happened to link up with the main partner who represented the NHL in collective bargaining back in 2003 when I was a young associate at Proskauer, and Bob Batterman, who was the partner, was looking for a young, eager, hardworking associate who could manage the project with him and for him. And so with him as my mentor, I got to work every single day. Every day was like a year in collective bargaining when the NHL had a season-long work stoppage in 04-05. And that was really my very quick indoctrination into the NHL world. I got to, as a very young person, probably unusually so, got to work directly with Commissioner Bettman and Bill Daly and David Zimmerman and all of the senior leadership at the NHL. And so much so that when collective bargaining was over and we had our new agreement, they hired me to come in-house.
Interesting. So in talking to a lot of people in the women in the sports arena, it seems that a lot of people came from the outside in rather than started maybe as an intern. There were a few people who started as an intern or a floor wiper or whatever on basketball, but would you say that a legal profession or business profession is the way to go for somebody trying to break in?
It was for me a successful route for a couple of reasons. I felt like as a woman, as an underrepresented person in the industry, it gave me, I think, a level of credibility coming in the door through the professional route that was helpful, I think, as a starting point. But also, I would say I also really worked my way up, like some of the stories that you're referencing. Throughout my career, I had countless internships, really from the time I was 16. I worked at the NFL, I worked at agencies, I worked at marketing agencies, I worked for on-air talent, I worked at different media companies on the sports side, all in an internship capacity, really to learn the industry and to build my network, because as folks who work in the industry know, or others who are interested in being in the industry know, it is a very small industry and everyone seems to know everyone. And when you're not in it, it can be very intimidating. But my approach was really to have a quality-based networking approach where I would try to attend conferences or events consistently so that repeat instances of meeting people, I was able to really build, I think, more substantive and long-lasting relationships, which really helped me in my career.
Okay. And did some of those relationships help you go from the NHL to lacrosse? Like, talk about a little bit of that transition and what that was like. That's a big change in many ways.
It was a big change. It was a very hard change for a lot of reasons. Leaving the NHL, which, as I just described, was my dream job. I mean, if you met people I went to high school with, they would have said that I would have never left the NHL because I love hockey and I love the NHL. I made a decision, and maybe it's in part some of the references I made earlier to the self-reflection that I do as a general practice for my own sort of keeping tabs on how I'm doing, that continuing to work at the NHL in that capacity wouldn't really allow me to reach my potential. And in part because it's such a big organization, and no matter how important my role was there, and I do feel like I had the opportunity to contribute and worked with amazing people and got amazing opportunities to contribute. It just felt like at the end of the day, I was a very small cog in a very big wheel. And that's probably the case for a lot of big businesses. And I really felt like I wanted the opportunity to try and work in a different kind of work environment where it was a little more scrappy in terms of being a challenger property, being more risk tolerant, and being able to infuse more innovation into our approach to the next generation of fans, and to have more of a leadership role in the full holistic business, as opposed to sort of one vertical that I was responsible for. And that's really what led me to the NLL and my current role. And yes, it was absolutely by virtue of my network of people who helped me do a lot of soul searching about what I was looking for, to really make sure that what I was going to really help me to achieve what I was looking to achieve in the next phase of my career.
And so what was it like when you first got to lacrosse? I mean, you've been there a little while now. Do you feel the game has really seen some momentum? What's happening on that front?
So I'm 2.5 years into my role. And since I've joined, we have expanded by 2 teams. So we've gone from 13 to 15 teams, which each of those transactions is massive, massive undertaking, massive opportunity for growth. We've recast our media partnerships and landscapes. So we went from a deal with Turner and BR Live to now we are on ESPN in the US and TSN in Canada, which for those who aren't familiar with the Canadian media landscape, really the sort of equivalent of ESPN. They're actually related entities. So we've completely recast our media distribution strategy. We have introduced new corporate social responsibility initiatives at the league. Actually, this past November, we announced NLL Unites, which is our CSR platform to really communicate our why, our cause. I really believe that purpose-driven storytelling and education initiatives is really, particularly for a challenger property like ours, a differentiator in the marketplace. And we have a very strong culture around Indigenous roots, which is obviously very socially relevant today, and very authentic to the sport of lacrosse. And we're working on a variety of new initiatives. We've announced several and one more to come on Friday that's in the works, new non-endemic sponsorship and partnerships. Again, all towards sort of taking the league more mainstream, having the league be where sports fans are and go. We are now, as of a year ago, since I joined, selling merchandise with Fanatics, our partner at Fanatics, so that sports fans can shop in the place where they shop for other sports, NLL shirts, hats, jerseys, etc. So yeah, there's a lot of momentum in the league in terms of our growth.
So I actually have always wondered about this. Lacrosse is so popular in schools at all levels. What's been the challenge at the professional level?
Yeah, it's very, it's a question that I had, frankly, before I joined, because it's a little perplexing why lacrosse isn't more popular, considering the grassroots growth. I guess what I would say is that it takes a generation, number one, to build fandom, right? Particularly if you're doing it through grassroots. So 30 years ago, 20 years ago, lacrosse was not popular like it is today. So those people who grew up playing lacrosse are just now getting to the point where they're in their 20s, 30s, 40s. And that is the beginning of sort of this next generation of fans for us. A good example of that is that one of our most recent ownership groups are former lacrosse players, and they run enormous hedge funds now.
That's helpful.
But yeah, super helpful. They love the game. They love lacrosse. They want to be involved in the growth of lacrosse. They coach on the side. Their kids play. And so, yeah, I think over time, you're going to start to see that. But also the other observation that we're really trying to take a leadership role in is really about the fragmentation of the sport. And I think the more we can serve as a beacon of unification for the different stakeholders to come together on joint initiatives, the easier it'll be for the consumer to find us and support us and not be confused by the landscape. There needs to be like a North Star that everybody from a marketing perspective, having too many initials, brands, messages, communicators can really bifurcate your audience. And I think that's been a bit of impediment to the lacrosse growth.
Okay. And I have a question from the audience. I'm going to ask you now, and it has to do with marketing. Can you talk about cause marketing and sports philanthropy and how much that has changed in the last decade or so?
Yes. Well, for me, this is my passion point. I genuinely believe that really the sort of old school way of marketing, which is just like branding or static images or what has been in sports, just like a dasher board, signage, just not going to penetrate. And one of the things that cause marketing will do for leagues and for sports is really have the fans understand why we matter and what we stand for, what we care about. And we know from the data that the next generation of fans, particularly millennials and Gen Zs, will make decisions based on their belief that a sports brand or any brand for that matter really genuinely and authentically care about cause. And so from my perspective, it's table stakes at this point. And I think the sports industry is a little bit late to this line of thinking. I'll give full credit to the NBA that started NBA Cares at least 10 to 15 years ago, before the rest of professional sports, frankly, had sort of caught on to this concept of do good and do well, that you can appropriately leverage philanthropy and doing good in the communities for your brand to do well, as long as it's done the right way and as long as it's done appropriately and in good faith. So I think it's essential to any marketing strategy at this point. Certainly that's the NLL's focus.
So another question, do you think there'll be a point where we'll start to see women's teams flourish, or is it still early days?
This is the time, I think, for women's sports. And I think you're starting to see it, right? The WNBA, the NWSL, they're flourishing. And it's not philanthropy for a business anymore. It's not thought of as philanthropy. There's real data to support that there's business reasons to invest in women's sports. People care and watch about women's sports. In fact, some of the data shows that a women's sports fan is a more engaged sports fan because of that cause-related element. They really care. They really want it to be successful. It's not a passive experience for a women's sports fan. I would argue in some ways, and I've often said this internally, that the NLL has a lot of similarities to women's sports in that way, because people who follow it like really care. And it's much less of a casual or passive experience.
Do you think there'll be a time where you'll see professional and women playing in the NLL, like a women's league, or are we a little ways off?
I think certainly in the field game, probably closer in time than the indoor game, which is our version of lacrosse. And again, this is sort of a little bit in the weeds of what I was referring to about the fragmentation of lacrosse, which is that there's so many versions of lacrosse. This is the other thing that I think is a real challenge for people. Unlike say like soccer, like you can pick up a soccer ball, like whether you're in Mexico or in Canada or in Israel, soccer is soccer.
Right.
In lacrosse, there's girls lacrosse, there's boys lacrosse, there's field game, there's the indoor game, there's now sixes, which is another version of lacrosse that just came out that is the international version. And so from that perspective, it will be a potential obstacle, I think, for making the transitions. For example, there's an outdoor lacrosse league, the PLL. We share 40% of our players with them, but not 100% because not every player can play in both leagues. So because it's a different version of the game.
Got it. Okay. Wow. That'll create some complications, but it is interesting to see the momentum that's been going on. And we actually are just about out of time. So I'm going to have you throw to your takeaways. This has been a really great conversation, by the way, and we'll go from there.
My takeaways. This was actually really fun to do when you guys asked me to think about 3 key takeaways. So I guess my first takeaway is I think maybe the opposite of what I think people's tendency is to do, which is to try to really like lean into disproportionately focusing on your weaknesses, improving your weaknesses. And that's not to say that you shouldn't be aware of them and manage them. But I think really what I've tried to do in my career is manage my weaknesses and backfill as needed in areas where I know I might not be as strong, but really lean into my strengths. And do the things that you know you do well and not be afraid to sort of acknowledge or admit that you need help in some areas, because not everybody can be everything to everyone. And I think that's okay. That's why we have a lot of people around us who can help us. The second is we talked about this a little bit already, to always remember and share your why. I think context is everything. I really live by this, not just in my professional life in terms of how I manage people and initiatives that we do that are public facing with fans, but also in my personal life with my children. It's my mantra of how I parent my children. I always try to give them some context if I'm asking them for something or asking them to do something. And the last one, this is really, I can't take credit for this. This is a quote from Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who's one of my many sheroes, which is to fight for the things you care about, but do it in a way that will lead others to join you. I think there are ways to build consensus and have people really want to join you in your efforts to be successful or to push forward with an initiative. But it's the old like honey versus vinegar thing. You can get a lot done if you have allies and people around you who are supporting you and wanting you to be successful. And it's definitely a lot harder to do it when you're going at it alone. So I surround myself with a very large village of people who are part of every single success that I've ever had. So those are my 3 takeaways.
They're excellent and very thoughtful. They're actually really great words to live and work by. So thank you for them. And thank you for joining us today. This has been a lot of fun and really interesting learning more about lacrosse and what your role is. So thanks for joining us, and hope to see you again soon at one of our events.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Lisa, and have a great day.
Thank you. You too. And thanks to everyone for joining us today. We will see you back here on January 26th.